who are the Pharisees? So it comes from the Greek word. It comes from the Greek word Phariseos. It comes from the Greek word Phariseos, and it also has a Hebrew origin. And the Hebrew origin of the word is also parash. And parash, when you look that up in like a Hebrew lexicon, it actually means to separate or distinguish. It means to separate or to distinguish. And when we think about the Pharisees, because we spoke about the Pharisees like some time ago, when we think about the Pharisees, the idea of parash, the idea of to separate and to distinguish, is pretty much what the Pharisees are all about. Because when you think about the history of the Pharisees, when you really dig into like the history of them, the idea is this: that they felt like they had to distinguish themselves or separate themselves as like a separate group of people who are intentionally there to carry on the tradition of the ancestors. So for instance, right, blueletterbible.org, a reference that I like to mention. It's a totally free website. So if you're looking for a free Bible resource that you wanna use, this particular Bible resource has lexicons, has commentary, and a bunch of other things that's just really that would cost you like thousands of dollars to have access to. So according to that website, according to blueletterbible.org, this is how they would describe the Pharisees. They would describe the Pharisees as a sect that seems to have started after Jewish exile. In addition to Old Testament books, the Pharisees recognized the oral tradition as a standard of belief in life. They sought for distinction, once again, thinking about their Hebrew word to separate and distinguish. They sought for distinction and praise by outward observance of external rites and by outward forms of piety, such as ceremonial washing, fastings, prayers, and almsgiving, or just giving, essentially. That's all that is. And comparatively, neglect of genuine piety. So this is all for show, pretty much. They prided themselves on their fancied good works. And one of the things that I want to hit on here is this idea of oral tradition. Right, Sister Paul mentioned it last week when she taught a phenomenal lesson on Mark chapter 7. But in the statement where it says, in addition to Old Testament books, the Pharisees recognized the oral tradition. So what exactly is the oral tradition? Because I want to pause right here, because if we understand just a little bit of information about the oral tradition within Judaism, we can understand why Jesus has such an issue with the Pharisees. So according to Britannica, which is an online encyclopedia, a very reputable resource, something else that's free that I recommend using. I'm all about, recommending free resources because biblical resources can get pricey. So according to Britannica, the oral tradition of Judaism is known as the Unwritten Torah. So we know we have the Torah, right? That's the law of Moses, the law of the prophets, right? The first 5 books of the Old Testament. That would be known as the written Torah, right? And it is believed that essentially the written Torah came directly from God. And in addition to the written Torah, there is also something known as the unwritten Torah. So that's known as the oral tradition, oral meaning mouth. So this is something that was pretty much like word of mouth, if you will. So when we start to dig into that, this is where we begin to understand why Jesus has such an issue with the Pharisees. Because according to the Jewish virtual library.org, the oral law is a legal commentary on the Torah, explaining how its commandments are to be carried out. So the oral tradition, or the oral law, or the unwritten Torah, pretty much includes different ways to interpret the written law. So I'll backtrack. So once again, we're talking about the oral law or the oral tradition or the unwritten Torah. And we know that the Pharisees have a heavy emphasis on the oral law, on the unwritten Torah. And there's some pros to that. There's actually some pros to the Pharisees closely adhering to the oral law, to the oral tradition, and to the unwritten Torah, because, as I said previously, it actually helped them preserve the traditions and the faith of their ancestors while they were in bondage. So while they were in bondage to the Babylonians, and just throughout the ages, when they found themselves just pretty much like scattered about and stuff like that, the oral tradition is what helped them preserve their faith, right? But there are some obvious cons. So the obvious cons to following the oral tradition or the unwritten Torah or the oral law is that essentially, because the oral law is supposed to be there to help them interpret the written tradition or the written Torah, they would pretty much elevate the oral tradition over the written law. And we observe this in Matthew chapter 15, verses 2 through 9. This is a story that some of you may be familiar with. So Matthew chapter 15, verses 2 through 9 is an example of where they elevate the oral law or the oral tradition or the unwritten Torah over the written Torah. So this is a conversation that's taking place between the Pharisees and Jesus in Matthew chapter 15, verses 2 through 9. The text reads, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders?" This is the Pharisees speaking. They're asking Jesus, why does Jesus's disciples transgress? Watch this, not the written Torah, right? But why do they transgress the tradition of the elders? Why do they transgress the oral law? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. Jesus answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? So when Jesus says that, he's saying, why do you transgress? Why do you disrespect? Why do you not adhere to the written law because of your oral law? And this is Jesus speaking, for God commanded, saying, honor your father and mother, which is the written law. And he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. Once again, that's written law, that's written Torah. But you say, this is what Jesus is saying that the Pharisees would say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. The reason why the Pharisees put an emphasis there is because that's what the oral law said. Thus, you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. That's why he refers to it as a tradition, because ultimately there's going to be a difference, obviously, between the written Torah, which we believe comes from God, versus the oral Torah, which comes from man. And as a result, because they follow the oral Torah over the written Torah, Jesus refers to them as hypocrites, as he does throughout the scriptures. He says, hypocrites. Isaiah did well to prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So I wanted to point that out because that can help us understand why Jesus had such a big issue with the Pharisees, because it wasn't so much that the Pharisees didn't know the law. They obviously knew the law, but they didn't adhere to it, not because they felt like the law was pointless, but what they did was they elevated the oral law or the man-made tradition over the written tradition. And that's where they collided with Jesus a lot. Next person up is Herod. So we see somebody mentioned in the text in verse 15 who goes by the name of Herod. Herod's name in Greek means heroic. If you were to talk to the people, specifically the Jewish people of the first century, what they thought about Herod, I don't think that they would describe him as heroic. because Herod had an interesting reputation. Let's backtrack a little bit, because one of the things you also need to realize, like if you decide to look this up in your own time, that historically you'll see that there will be somebody named Herod Antipas and Herod the Great. So the Herod that we see mentioned in the text that interacts with Jesus, that's Herod Antipas. And Herod the Great is actually Herod Antipas's father. So just as a side note right there. But Herod had an interesting reputation. So Herod was one of those guys who was connected politically, which is one of the reasons why he found himself as the ruler of Galilee during this particular time. He pretty much knew the right people in high places politically, which is why, like I said, he was able to sustain and also acquire the power that he had. But also the problem that ended up happening is that he would actually like oppress the people that he was supposed to be leading. So because of that, obviously it causes strife between the people you're supposed to be over, because obviously like you're oppressing them, you're doing a bunch of different things that don't really work in their favor, but they basically work for you. They don't really work for them. And we know throughout the Bible, when you look at Herod's life, there's obviously, like a couple things that he did. One of the most notable things that he did was that he actually beheaded John the Baptist. And if you remember that particular story, there's a feast going on, and pretty much like prior to this feast, John the Baptist actually spoke out against Herod, because Herod pretty much married somebody that he had no business marrying. And because Herod married this particular person, John the Baptist spoke out against them. So during this particular feast, the woman that he married, she had a daughter, and the daughter did some sort of dance for Herod, and it really pleased him to the point where he pretty much said, "Hey, whatever you ask for, as long as it's within my power, up to half my kingdom, I'll give it to you." So the daughter pretty much asked the mother, "Hey, what should I ask for?" And the mother was like, "Yeah, tell him to bring me John the Baptist's head." And that's pretty much what ended up happening, because he didn't want to, basically seem like he wasn't a man of his word. So he pretty much ended up, beheading John the Baptist, pretty much because of a promise that he made to somebody that, we pretty much shouldn't have made a promise to. So that's Herod, specifically Herod Antipas. Next up is John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is an interesting character. So when we see the name John the Baptist in the text as of right now, the reason why we see his name is because no one actually sees John. When we context the John the Baptist name comes up in this chapter is because Jesus asks the question, "Who do people say that I am?" Right. So what are pretty much people saying about me? He's asking his disciples, and they say that some people say that you are John the Baptist. And I don't know about you, but I really felt like when you think about people thinking about Jesus's ministry or Jesus himself being John the Baptist, the way that I see it is that this is pretty much a victory for John the Baptist, because at least in my mind, it means that the work that John the Baptist was doing resembled the work that Jesus was currently doing. And I say that's a victory for John, because it pretty much means that he was doing ministry correctly. Because if there's anybody that we should model our ministries after, it should obviously be after the ministry of Jesus Christ, right? And when you look at the comparisons between John the Baptist's ministry and Jesus's ministry, the obviously like the comparisons are definitely there. John obviously baptized people. Jesus obviously baptized people. John the Baptist spread the good news of the kingdom, while Jesus obviously spread the good news of the kingdom. John got into disputes with major political figures. Herod, obviously, because we just got finished speaking about how Herod had John the Baptist beheaded, and obviously Jesus got into disputes with political figures who were also religious. Obviously, Jesus constantly gets into disputes and arguments with the Pharisees. So we see the similarities between their two ministries. And then even when we dive a little deeper, we get a chance to see what the Bible actually says about John the Baptist, right? So the Bible would say that John was the voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Matthew chapter 3, verse 3. We know that John the Baptist said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Matthew chapter 3, verse 1. And we know that John the Baptist baptized with water, and also told us about another who was coming, who will baptize with the Holy Spirit. Mark chapter 1, verse 8. And obviously that was a reference to Jesus Christ. And the reason why, once again, I backtrack, when Jesus asked the question, who do people say that I am? And some people were saying that he's John the Baptist, is because Jesus's ministry was a mirror of pretty much what exactly John the Baptist's ministry looked like. And once again, that's a victory, because ultimately we know that John the Baptist came to prepare the way for Jesus Christ. So shout out to John the Baptist. Next up is Elijah. Elijah is actually a really cool character that gets talked about in the Bible. Once again, the reason why Elijah's name even gets mentioned is because, once again, this is also his name gets mentioned as Jesus is asking the question, who do people say that I am? So some said that Jesus is John the Baptist. Other people said that he's Elijah. So some people thought that Jesus's ministry, or the way that Jesus was moving, resembled the ministry of Elijah. And I found that interesting, right? Because, and we can argue if y'all want to argue, but I think that the reason why people thought Jesus was Elijah is because of the boldness that Jesus had. And the main reason I say that is because Elijah wasn't one of these punk prophets. Not that there were any punk prophets in the Bible, but there are a lot of people who claim to be prophets nowadays, and they just ain't about that life, right? So when you look at Elijah's story, which can be found in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, we see that Elijah was not the type of prophet to just let heresy and ungodliness go unchecked. He was not that guy. Elijah was a bold prophet. A prime example we can see is how Elijah interacts with the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings, toward the end of 1 Kings chapter 18. So if you don't know the context, let me just kind of frame that for you. So essentially, the nation is in disarray, and essentially these prophets move in who are pretty much convincing the people to worship a false god. So Elijah comes in worshiping the God that we worship, and he issues a challenge to the prophets of Baal, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, there were about 400 of them. So he issues a challenge to the prophets of Baal, and he pretty much says this: we're gonna have a sacrifice, right? So we're gonna create an altar, and we're gonna put the animal on top of our altars, right? And if Baal, if your God can set a fire under that sacrifice, then that's proof that he's real. So let's look at 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 25 to 27. And the text reads, then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, you go first. This is the New Living Translation, by the way. Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, you go first, for there are many of you. There's about 400 of them. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God. But do not set fire to the wood, because once again, that's how they're proving if Baal exists in the first place. So don't try to give your God no help. So the prophets of Baal prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. Now listen to what Elijah, this is what I'm talking about, Elijah being so bold. Listen to what Elijah says after seeing these dudes dancing around this dead animal and this altar from morning until noontime. So about noontime, Elijah began mocking them. You'll have to shout louder, he scoffed, for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming, or he is relieving himself. Like, bro, hey, why are you so disrespectful? Or maybe he is away on a trip, or is asleep and needs to be awakened. So when you see how Elijah interacts with these prophets, right? I feel like it is exactly how Jesus interacts with the Pharisees, right? And Jesus literally like mocks the Pharisees right to their face. And some people may ask, well, how does Jesus, they may say, how does Jesus mock the Pharisees to their faces, right? Well, Jesus actually mocks the Pharisees to their faces in the same way that Elijah's mocking the prophets of Baal, by asking this question: have you read? So Jesus, every time you see that statement, when Jesus is interacting with the Pharisees, that's Jesus actually mocking, or in some ways being very condescending or sarcastic to the Pharisees. I actually like to call it sanctified sarcasm. But that's Jesus's way of being sarcastic or mocking the Pharisees, because he's asking the Pharisees, have you read? And how exactly is that Jesus' way of mocking the Pharisees? Well, it's a way to mock the Pharisees, because asking a Pharisee, people who spend all day reading and studying the scriptures, have they read, is the equivalent of asking a doctor, do they know what Advil is? It's the equivalent of asking an attorney, do they know what the United States Constitution is? It's the equivalent of asking a preacher, do they know what the Bible is? So that's essentially why people ask, or people said, that Jesus is John the Baptist, or that Jesus is Elijah. It's because Jesus was so bold in the way that he was interacting with the Pharisees. And real quick, can everybody check to make sure they put themselves on mute, please? So the last part of the scripture, once again, we're still in the area, we're still on verse 28, which is where Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? So the people have said that he's John the Baptist, the people have said that he's Elijah, and then the people also said some of the other prophets, right? For those of you who have computers or smartphones that can actually see the screen, I have a pop quiz. So just take yourself off mute if you can answer this question. So based upon who you see on the screen, we see Daniel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. What do all of these prophets have in common? Or better question, what type of literature do these type of prophets belong to? Looking for two words.
Major prophets.
Yes. Who said that? I cannot see you. Oh, Sister Paul. I know Sister Paul would know that. Go ahead, Sister Paul. But yes, all of these are major prophets. Once again, just a little side note, they're not major prophets because they're better or more important than any of the other prophets, but they're referred to as major prophets because their books are longer. So long story short, if you want to be very important, you got to write long books. I'm joking. Don't take that. But that's what these prophets have in common. Now, I specifically put these up here just because this is all I can fit on the screen, because at least from my research, when it says other prophets, it's not a direct reference to like specific prophets. So when they say other prophets, it's just kind of like when we look at the scriptures, when we read the Hebrew Bible, right? And we read what all these other prophets did and how they wrote, they can see it inside of Jesus and how Jesus is moving. So when we're trying to understand this, at least when I was going through it, I should say, it basically means that Jesus has the same qualities as some of the other prophets that we see throughout the Old Testament. So at least in my mind, when I think about Jesus and his ministry and some of the other prophets, I can at least see that this can possibly mean that Jesus wept like Jeremiah, right? Because Jeremiah is known as the lamenting prophet. That Jesus had the boldness of Elijah. He was determined like Daniel. He prophesied like Ezekiel. He knew his history like Ezra. He led his people like Joshua. He talked with God like Moses. And he sounded like the guy that's spoken of in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. And if you don't know it, I got it for you. Don't worry. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 says, "For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." So when they say other prophets, like, that's pretty much what they're trying to get across. They can essentially see how Jesus is matching up with the prophets of the Old Testament, which is obviously very crucial to our understanding, because it basically means that Jesus is doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing. So the next person that we're going to talk about is Peter. And we see Peter in this text because Peter actually responds to the question that Jesus asks after the disciples tell him, who do people say that he is? So the people said that he is John the Baptist, Elijah, and some of the other prophets. And then Jesus counters and says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter's the one that stands up and says, thou art the Christ, right? And that was a really pivotal moment, because it shows that Peter basically understands who Jesus Christ is, which sounds very elementary, but as you can see throughout the gospel narratives, it can be very easy to miss Jesus even though he's right in front of you. So that was a very pivotal moment, not just in the Bible, but also in the life and ministry of Peter. But who is Peter, right? Who is this guy named Peter? So according to the New King James Life Application Study Bible, which once again, that resource isn't free, but that's actually one of my favorite resources to use. They actually have entire profiles on pretty much all of the biblical characters, right? Or I should say on some of the more major biblical characters. So some of the things that the Life Application Study Bible had to say about Peter is this. They said that they said that Peter was the recognized leader of Jesus's disciples, which is 100% accurate. Jesus, why I keep saying Jesus? Peter was the great voice of the gospel during and after Pentecost. So if we go, into the book of Acts and we see Pentecost, which obviously took place after Jesus ascended into heaven, pretty much Peter, this dynamite, and God, I'm trying to remember the number, but it was like thousands of people got saved off this one dude's message. So once again, was a great voice, was the great voice of the gospel during and after Pentecost. So that was some of his like positive qualities, right? But Peter wasn't perfect, as some of you know. So some of the more negative qualities that Peter had, the writers of the Life Application Study Bible pretty much said this, is that he often spoke without thinking, was brash and impulsive. He denied Jesus 3 times, and initially found it difficult to accept Gentile believers. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that's Acts chapter 10. So I believe it was the house of Cornelius. Pretty much they had received the Holy Spirit, and Peter had he didn't have an issue with God doing that, but he just didn't expect him to do that. And that kind of hit him home a little bit. And we know that, I believe it's Galatians, him and Peter and Paul actually got into it about whether or not Gentile believers should follow the law or not, should strictly adhere to the law or not. So Peter, to make a long story short, Peter was a complicated guy with a complicated story. Because in certain parts of the Bible, we see that he truly understands and loves the Lord. And then in other parts of the text, we pretty much see the expression of his humanity. And the thing I love most about Peter is that if I'm being honest with y'all, and it's just y'all, it's nobody else on here. Like Peter is one of the few biblical characters that I feel like I truly identify with. And it's just because of that whole dynamic of, yo, like this dude really loved the Lord. Like he really knew Jesus, right? Um, but even though he really loved the Lord and really knew Jesus, he still made mistakes. And if I'm just being honest, listen, I love the Lord and I know Jesus, but sometimes I make mistakes, you know? And like I said, I feel like I can closely identify with Peter because once again, if I'm sharing a moment of transparency with y'all, I don't actually do this, but there are moments in my life when, listen, you know, I am more than willing to pray for you. Like I really want to pray for you, but then there's other moments when I'm like, let me take out this sword and slice off your ear, you know. But it's just like, if we're being honest, there are just times when, you know, once again, we love the Lord, but we just have like that expression of humanity, as I like to call it. So Peter's one of the few ones that I can closely identify with. And lastly, as far as the people are concerned, the people portion of this lesson, the text mentions elders, chief priests, and elders, chief priests, and scribes. They mention elders, chief priests, and scribes. So who are the elders? According to blueletterbible.org, once again, free online resource, so definitely use that. This is a reference to the members of the Great Council, what's known as the Sanhedrin or the Sanhedrin, however you want to pronounce that E, is totally up to you. And according to Britannica, another free resource online to use, the Sanhedrin could be described in the following way. The Sanhedrin is any several official Jewish councils in Palestine under Roman rule to which various political, religious, and judicial functions have been attributed. It's taken from the Greek word for council, and the term was apparently applied to various bodies, but became especially the designation for the Supreme Jewish Legislative and Judicial Court, the Great Sanhedrin, or simply the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. So that's, when they say the elders, that's who that's referencing. We also see mention of something known as the chief priests. So according to blueletterbible.org, once again, a free Bible resource. This is a reference to the high priests. And these comprise, in addition to one holding the high priestly office, but those who had previously been discharged. And although they've been discharged, they continue to have great power in the state. So pretty much the chief priests could be those who currently serve in the high priest office, or it could also be a reference to those who had served at one point in the high priest office, but they don't serve in that capacity anymore. But because they were once high priests, they still had great power within that particular area. And the scribes, we also see make mention of the scribes. So according to blueletterbible.org, which hopefully y'all know, it's a what? It's a free Bible resource. A scribe was a man learned in the Mosaic law and in the sacred or secret writing. Scribes studied the most difficult and subtle questions of the law. They added to the Mosaic law decisions of various kinds, thought to basically elucidate its meaning. To make a long story short, the scribes were pretty much like professional interpreters of the law of Moses, and we can actually see them as pretty much like the theologians of their time. So those are the people that are mentioned in Mark chapter 8. And now we're going to dive into the places that are mentioned in Mark chapter 8. So for those of you that can't see my screen, I definitely recommend you see it because I have a map up that might help, I don't know, maybe bring some understanding. So there is mention of a place known as, in verse 10, there's a make mention of a place known as the region of Dalmanutha. Dalmanutha. So when you look up that word Dalmanutha, it's the purple line for those of you that can see my screen. Dalmanutha in Greek actually means slow firebrand. And once again, that comes from blueletterbible.org, which you guessed it is a free Bible resource. And Dalmanutha is a town on the west side of the Sea of Galilee near Magnolia. So if you can see where the purple line is, that's exactly what it's pointing to. Yasmin Hafiz, in the article, what's the title? Here it is. The title of the article is Dalmanutha, biblical town mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, possibly discovered, archaeologists claim. This particular writer described, basically says this, that Dalmanutha, a biblical town, which is described in the Gospel of Mark as the place where Jesus sailed after miraculously multiplying a few loaves and fish to feed 4,000 people. So that's Dalmanutha. The next place that we see mentioned is Bethsaida. We do hear about Bethsaida quite a bit in throughout the Bible. Bethsaida is the green arrow that's pretty much stretching across the Sea of Galilee. And Bethsaida actually means, in Greek, it actually means house of fish. So Bethsaida was a small fishing village on the west shore of Lake Gennesaret, home of Andrew, Peter, Philip, and John. And the last one is Caesarea Philippi, which is mentioned in verse 27, and that is the red arrow. And Caesarea actually means severed. Caesarea Philippi was situated at the foot of Lebanon. So we've covered the people that we see in Mark chapter 8, the places, and to end it off, we're going to unpack some principles, just essentially three principles that really stuck out to me as I'm going through this chapter. Once again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are just three things that, like I said, really stuck out to me. So in verse 6, the principle that we'll unpack is what I refer to as the divinity of delegation. That's according to verse 6. Verse 34 and 35, we see the calling of Christ, what I refer to as the calling of Christ. In verses 36 and 37, we see what I refer to as the sales price for the soul. The sales price for the soul. So Mark chapter 8, verse 6 reads, "So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and they set them before the multitude." Once again, I see this as the divinity of delegation. So the part I want you to focus on with this particular verse, and this is the part that stuck out to me, is I want us to focus on the part about the loaves. So it says right here, it says, he took the loaves, meaning Jesus. Jesus took the loaves and gave thanks, broke them, gave them to his disciples, and then the disciples gave them to the multitude. So here, once again, we see what I refer to as the divinity of delegation, and I see the importance. I see the importance in this particular scripture of making sure that even though you have the most powerful gift, it doesn't mean that you have to be the one that's doing all of the work, right? Because when we think about Jesus and his ministry, obviously, because he is the Son of Man, because he is the Son of God, because he is all powerful, Jesus could have just created some other type of way to get the bread to the people, right? But instead of him using all of that power that he has at his disposal to get this bread to the people, he instead looks to his disciples to distribute the bread for him. He delegates the responsibility to somebody else who could also do the task. And we should look at this as a call to get others involved, right? Especially for those of us who serve in some type of leadership capacity, because this is a principle. The principle of delegation is what I'm referring to. This is a principle that we see all throughout the Bible. We see it in multiple parts. In the book of Exodus, we see it when Jethro advises Moses to appoint other people to deal with the smaller issues going on within the Israelite community. And he specifically recommended that he do that just so that way Moses would not get burnt out. And if there was a matter that the elders that Moses appointed couldn't handle, then that's when you would bring the issue to Moses. And we also see it in the book of Acts. I believe it's chapter 6. Don't quote me if that's wrong, but it's definitely in the book of Acts. But I believe it's in Acts chapter 6, maybe it's chapter 7, where we see Peter make the statement about how should the apostles pretty much be taken away from study and from prayer to white tables, right? And if you want to understand the context a little bit, pretty much what was happening, that there were some widows, I believe it was the Hellenistic widows, who were neglected, as the Bible would say, during the daily distribution of food. And pretty much some people brought this issue to the apostles, and the apostles was like, bro, like, somebody can definitely do this, right? It doesn't have to be the apostles, have to be the one that's always passing out the food. Not that they were above passing out the food, but it's like, yo, we're here trying to study, we're trying to pray, we're trying to make sure that we're hearing from God, so that way the ministry continues to flow. So how about this? Let's delegate some other people to do this, who are capable, who do this with integrity, and who love the Lord, so that way this particular issue gets solved. So in this particular scripture, we see what I refer to as the divinity of delegation. And the next one that we're going to discuss is what I refer to as the calling of Christ. Mark chapter 8, verses 34 and 35 read, when he had called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. We see the calling of Christ. And essentially, the idea of a calling is this. Essentially, you're in one place, right? And the person in authority is essentially telling you to go to a different place, right? So when we think about serving God, it's about serving God within our calling. It's about serving in the capacity that God is expecting us to serve in. And based upon the scripture, I essentially see two aspects of the calling that God has on all of our lives. I see the aspect of denial, and I see an aspect of direction. So for our callings, I see the aspect of denial, and I see the aspect of direction. And when we look at the text says, whoever desires to come after me, whoever desires to come with me, let him deny himself. There is an aspect of denial that's involved with our calling. And the idea of denying oneself is essentially this. It means to disown. That's essentially what denial means. It means to disown. Term that has no sense, connection with the of his sinful nature. So the idea is essentially that we have to get into the habit of disowning or not adhering to our sinful nature. Now, this does not mean that we deny the existence of our sinful nature, because if anybody ever tries to do that, number one, that's going to be just impossible, because we can't do it, right? But even the Bible talks about that if anybody says he has no sin, he is a liar and the truth is not in him. So just because we're saved doesn't mean that we're going to deny that our sinful nature exists. But one of the awesome parts about this particular portion of the calling is that we're not denying that our sinful nature exists, but rather we have to be intentional. And I think that's the most powerful word in this whole equation. We have to be intentional about putting off the desires of our sinful nature in order that we can have direction from Christ. because that's a part of our calling. A part of our calling, like, yes, some of us are called to teach, some of us are called to preach, some of us are called to evangelize, but essentially we're all called to still live the same way. And one of the ways we're supposed to live is we're supposed to use the power that God has given us to essentially say no to our sinful nature. And once we get to that place when we are using the power of God, because that's also another aspect of this, is not us fighting off our sinful nature, but it's us utilizing the power of God that God has placed on the inside of us to fight our sinful nature. We can now move in the direction that Christ wants us to move in. And when I say direction, that's referring to the aspect in the text where it says, taking up your cross and following him. Taking up your cross and following him. And the idea of taking up a cross is to take up a burden. And specifically, is to take up a burden that you don't have to take, right? And the main reason I say you don't have to take it is because ultimately, God is not going to force you to follow him. It's a conscious choice that you have to make. I once heard it said like this, that God is a gentleman and will not force himself on you. So it's something that you have to willingly do yourself. So God is not going to force himself on anybody. So what happens is that we have to make a conscious decision that we are going to deny ourselves and that we are going to live a certain way. And obviously that means that we're going to have to abstain from certain activities, abstain from certain mindsets and other type of sinful patterns, just so that way we can properly take up our crosses and be proper disciples of Jesus Christ, the calling of Christ. And the last part that I'm going to discuss for tonight is what I refer to as the sales price for the soul. The sales price for the soul. And I get this from verses 36 and 37, which read, "For will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world?" So the idea of profit, it refers to something that's it refers to something that is advantageous, right? Something that works in your favor. And the idea of gain in this text means to acquire. And when we see the word loses his soul, right? The idea of losing means to suffer loss or to suffer damage. And when it says loses his soul, the soul is referring to the part of ourselves that exists after our physical bodies passes away. And I should even say while our physical bodies are still here. Right? So when you put all that together, the idea that Jesus is trying to convey is this: is it advantageous for a man to acquire the whole world, to acquire everything that he could possibly want? And in the process of acquiring everything that he could possibly want physically, ends up suffering the loss of the part of himself that's eternal. And that's the idea. That's the idea that Jesus is trying to convey here. And one of the things that Jesus is also trying to convey is that he's essentially exposing us to one of the crafty strategies of the devil. The idea of gaining the world in exchange for our souls, right, is the same temptation that Jesus had to deal with in the wilderness. So if you remember that, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the book of Matthew, when Jesus is tempted in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, we know that at some point within that 40-day and 40-night period, Satan takes Jesus up, as the text refers to as an exceedingly high mountain, and shows him the splendor or the glory of all the kingdoms on the earth. And then Satan says to Jesus, well, Jesus, if you just bow down and worship me, I'll give you all this. I got this on lock. I will give you all this if you worship me. And that's essentially what Jesus is doing here. That's what we see in the text. We see the idea of riches over righteousness, of secular security over eternal security, of profit over people, moves over ministry, as I said before. Right? So the question that we need to ask ourselves is essentially this: what is the sales price for our soul? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. What is the sales price for our soul? How much do we think our soul is worth? Is it worth you hitting the Powerball? Is it worth you getting that fancy automobile, that big house, or whatever your desire is? Is it worth that? And when trying to answer this question, right, trying to figure out what your soul is worth to you, do not miss, once again, don't miss the subtlety of the scheme, right? And I call it the subtlety of the scheme because some people, when we think about selling our souls to the devil, as some people would say, some people think of it as like you're literally sitting down at a table with Satan and there's a contract in front of you that you have to sign with blood. Don't get caught up in the Hollywood aspect of selling your soul, because the best strategy that Satan uses to make us fall is subtlety. It's the small things that he tries to hit us with on a daily basis, because he knows that the small settlements that we make on a regular basis, they end up leading to major compromises in the future. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the sales price for our soul, right? And then once we come to the realization, once we have it in our heads, whatever the answer to that question may be, my hope is that there isn't anything that can be offered to us that will make us say, I'm going to compromise my faith in this manner. Because if there is, then essentially what ends up happening is, over time, you essentially begin to tell Satan and his demagogic workers, well, hey, I know I'm a Christian and I know I believe this, but if you just give me a little bit of this and a little bit of that, well, then maybe I can come over to your side. So we have to figure that out for ourselves. And then once we figure that out, then we pretty much have to realize that ultimately nothing, as Romans chapter 8 would say, that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed. And that's all that I have for you tonight. Any questions, comments,